In the late 1970s, using the original journals from the 1850s Palliser Expedition, I followed in the footsteps of Thomas Blackiston. In the early 1980s, the Alberta Historical Resources Foundation asked me to follow the footsteps of a Palliser Expedition partner named James Hector. He would go through Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay parks, also looking for a route for a railway. James Hector's route is largely preserved as Hector saw it, and is a gold mine for any history buffs. As he named and described landmarks, now little changed, you are able to see the world much as he saw it. I published a travel guide based on the original journal in 1983, and last year converted it into an audiobook, now on YouTube. Of late, I have been working on making it into an audiovisual production, with the hope that budding artists, both young and old, would enjoy the opportunity to practice their craft and enjoy some history at the same time. Fortunately for you, I have found professional voices to take you on your journey. And here is a quick overview of the route Hector and you will be following. You will have the luxury of being able to follow it from your car, approaching Banff from the east on highway from Calgary. Hector proceeds to Castle Mountain through Banff. Then he goes over the Vermilion Pass. After visiting the Paint Pot, as many of you are familiar with, continues following the highway alongside the Vermilion River and viewing Hector Gorge. Kootenay Crossing, north, there's a wilderness, and I would suggest you don't take it, but move along to Golden. Then you can meet up with them at Wapta Falls. You will then travel over the Kicking Horse Pass, named after Hector's encounter with his horse. Once again, you will reach the Bow Valley. Turn north on the Icefields Parkway to Saskatchewan Crossing, where you will visit Glacier Lake, before returning and following the David Thompson Highway towards Rocky Mountain House. Enjoy.
The journey. Here is the day-to-day record of James Hector's exploratory journey through the Rocky Mountains in 1858 with extracts from his journal. Saturday, August 7, 1858. Following the route of Highway 1A towards the mountains, Hector came to Deadman's River. Now known as Ghost River, legend has it that in the early days a ghost was seen going up and down this river, picking up the skulls of dead Indians who had been killed in battle by Cree Indians. Hector crossed the river at the point where it joins the Bow River. The site now is covered by the water of Ghost Lake. By evening, Hector arrived at the site of Old Bow Fort to prepare for his penetration of the Rockies in search of a possible route for a railway. Hector described Old Bow Fort this way.
Its site is marked only by a group of Marden stone chimneys, the remainder of the fort having been constructed of timber, all of which was long ago removed and used by the Indians as firewood. A small stream joins the river from the west at this place, and the main stream itself makes a bend from the north in an easterly course.
The remains of Old Bow Fort are located at Stony Indian Park, about 20 kilometers west of the Morley Cutoff on Highway 1A, 60 kilometers west of Calgary. John Palliser, in his report, says,
"The scenery is wild and beautiful. The Bow Fort was established by the H.B. Company for the purpose of trade with the slave Indians, a name applied by the Crees to the Blackfoot, Pagan, and Blood Indians. These tribes are considered by all who know them as the wildest and most dangerous of the Aborigines in British territory. The fort was ultimately abandoned by the company owing to the expense involved in keeping a sufficient staff of men for its protection. The barter was chiefly for provisions and buffalo robes, and very few fine furs were obtained, so that by the time the goods were transported and the few furs sent to Lake Winnipeg, very little profit resulted. Besides, frequent attacks were made on them by the Blackfeet, and several of the company's servants lost their lives defending the establishment."
Old Bow Fort had been chosen as a rendezvous point for the three parties which made up the Palliser Expedition. The groups were to explore the passes through the Rockies and find the most suitable route for a railway.
As we were to be here for some days and to make our arrangements for traveling in the mountains without the carts, we induced our stony Indian friends to camp beside us in order to get them to trade leather and pack saddles with us for tobacco and ammunition.
For 4 days the party was busy preparing for its work in the mountains. Wednesday, August 11, 1858. This is the first day of the James Hector journey, which will ultimately take him 57 days to complete. Accompanying Hector was the botanist Eugene Bourgeau, 3 men from the Red River area, named Brown, Sutherland, and Peter Erasmus, guide and interpreter. As well there was Nimrod, reputedly the best hunter of the Stony Indians. Hector could not pronounce his Indian name. According to the Bible, Nimrod, a descendant of Ham, is described as a mighty hunter. Traveling west along the Bow River, the party consisted of
8 horses, 3 of which served to carry all the little baggage I cared to take, consisting principally of instruments, bedding, ammunition, and tobacco.
They also took a little tea and grease, but had been assured that in the mountains, where they were to explore, there would be ample game. Following along the Bow River they entered a valley within the first range of the mountains. After traveling for about 30 kilometers, through fine open woods of young pine, over high-level terraces, they camped beside a series of lakes formed where the river had expanded. Bourgeau named the area Lacs de Arcs. Translated, it means Lakes of the Bow. From his campsite Bourgeau named 3 other peaks. One he called Pigeon Mountain, presumably because he saw wild pigeons in the area. Another peak was named Grotto Mountain because it contained a large cave with a high arched roof, and the third he called Windy Mountain, otherwise known as Wind Mountain, which was officially renamed Mount Lougheed in 1928 after Senator James Lougheed, one-time federal minister of the Interior. Bourgeau's original name was inspired by
a high peak to the west, on which the clouds were gathering and curling about.
Thursday, August 12, 1858. Today, Hector and Bourgeau climbed Grotto Mountain, which was behind their camp. Following a wild stream, they came across
trickling falls several hundred feet in height, splashing in a clear pool with green mossy banks, and in which we performed our morning ablutions.
Close by they discovered a large cave,
with a high arched roof and narrow mouth, and like Robinson Crusoe's, with its old goat for a tenant, but in this case he had long been dead.
Here the men split up, Bourgeau continuing on to investigate Windy Mountain while Hector and his party traveled for several kilometers along the side of the valley. Bourgeau did not continue with Hector. He remained behind collecting plant specimens and returned later to Old Beaufort. Eventually, he returned to England and gave his collection to Kew Gardens, London. Stopping for the night, Hector saw.
Just opposite our camp there is a mountain with 3 peaks which form a striking group.
It would be another 28 years before geologist George Mercer Dawson named the peaks the Three Sisters in 1886. The Three Sisters was so named because each peak resembles the other 2. Friday, August 13, 1858. As food was getting short they did not move their camp, and while Nimrod went hunting Hector discovered an abundance of fossils in the beds of limestone. The fossils helped Hector judge the age of the rocks. He continued to keep detailed notes and made sketches of each mountain and valley as he went along. Wherever he could, he measured the heights of the mountains too. Eventually, Nimrod returned after having killed a deer. Saturday, August 14, 1858. The party traveled 21 kilometers along the valley in 5 hours. Sunday, August 15, 1858. After an early start they soon reached
a beautiful little prairie at the base of the mountain where the water falls, as the Indian name has it, or the Cascade Mountain.
A spectacular view of Cascade Mountain can be seen from the Trans-Canada Highway on the westerly approach to the Banff traffic circle. The beautiful little prairie, at its base, is now Banff Airstrip. During the expedition Hector named the other feature mountain in the area, Mount Rundle, after the Reverend Robert Rundle, early Methodist missionary who visited the region in 1847. Monday, August 16, 1858. While waiting for his men to clear a track, Hector climbed Cascade Mountain where he saw a herd of mountain sheep, pikas, and marmots.
Among the blocks of rock the souffleurs, or mountain marmots kept whistling in a very loud shrill note answering one another, and I also heard the squeaking note of the little piker or tailless hare, which is very common here. This is one of the most comical animals I have seen. It is about the size of a small rat, but made exactly like any other rabbit, excepting that it has round open ears. It sits up on its hind legs and calls its note in the most impudent fashion faster and faster as you approach, but always ready to pop out of sight so quickly that you can hardly shoot them, at least with a flint gun.
Tuesday, August 17, 1858. During the course of the day the party covered 27 kilometers in 7 hours. While the men with the pack horses followed the track that had been cut out the day before, Hector and Nimrod
set off to see a fine fall on the river, which lay about 3 miles out of the direct course. A high hill stands out in the center of the valley, and it is in breaking past this that the river is compressed into a very narrow spout-like channel, and then leaps over a ledge of rocks about 40 feet in height.
At this point Hector was describing Bow Falls and Tunnel Mountain. Returning from his visit to the falls he noted that
above the rocky contraction of the channel the river is dilated and sluggish, and the valley is filled up with large swampy lakes.
Hector was referring to the Vermilion Lakes. Looking beyond the lakes, Hector reported,
"We had before us a truncated mountain, evidently composed of massive horizontal strata, and which I named Mount Burgo. The pass that Sir George Simpson crossed the Rocky Mountains by in his journey around the world lies to the south of this mountain, and I half thought of crossing the river and following it, but we found so much white water in the streams from the south showing that they were in flood. Crossed over a low point of rocks, close to the river, where we entered the second great valley, which is of magnificent proportions. Along the eastern side runs a wall of vertical beds, of light grey limestone, the serrated edges of which at once suggested the name of Sawback Range for them."
In the distance Hector noted,
"A very remarkable mountain still at the distance of 12 miles, which looks exactly like a gigantic castle."
He was referring to Castle Mountain, which was known for many years as Mount Eisenhower. Wednesday, August 18, 1858. Today, the party covered 19 kilometers. Their Indian guide, Nimrod, hurt his back severely after falling on his knife while chasing a moose. Hector later shot the animal, and after traveling a few kilometers they set up camp, opposite Castle Mountain, to prepare the meat. Thursday, August 19, 1858. Hector and Sutherland explored Castle Mountain. At one point,
"We saw several bands of sheep, but did not get a shot. However, we killed 2 of the marmots or souffleurs. It is the size of a badger, with coarse short hair and no proper fur. It has large incisor teeth like those of the beaver. It lives among the rocks, and has a large nest, in which it lays up stores of provisions for winter, during which season it never comes abroad. But whether it hibernates, or not, the Indians do not know. It returns to its hole late in September, at which time it is very fat and quite as good eating as the beaver, having the same rat flavor."
They explored the mountain for 12 hours before returning to camp. Friday, August 20, 1858. It took them 6 hours to their next camp, which was on the top of the Continental Divide at the Vermilion Pass. It was at this point that Hector noted,
"The first water we had seen flowing to the Pacific. I then ascended the mountain to the east for 1,000 feet above our camp, reaching the limit of the woods after 500 feet. The mountain is a mere spur from a large central mass of snow-capped mountains to the southeast, which I named Mount Ball, after the Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies. On the opposite side of the valley I saw that the Vermilion River rises from a glacier of small size in a high valley of Mount Lefroy."
General Sir John Henry Lefroy was a soldier and scientific advisor to the British Army. He was governor of the Bermudas in 1871, and Tasmania in 1880. Today, the group shot at its first white goat, but only succeeded in wounding it.
"They are very large animals and walk in a deliberate manner, picking their steps over the rocks as if their feet were tender."
Saturday, August 21, 1858.
The party encountered heavy soaking mist this morning, which soon wetted everything we had for the first time since entering the mountains.
For 4 hours they descended the valley of the Vermilion River. After 10 kilometers they arrived at the Vermilion Plain.
Its surface is entirely covered with yellow ochre, washed down from the ferruginous shales in the mountains. The Kootenay Indians come to this place sometimes, and we found the remains of a camp and of a large fire which they had used to convert the ochre into the red oxide which they take away to trade to the Indians of the low country, and also to the Blackfeet as a pigment, calling it vermilion.
This area is known as the Paint Pots, mineral springs which early white men mined for ochre. It was used as a base for paint. Sunday, August 22, 1858. An uneventful day. The party traveled 23 km along the Vermilion River over a period of 8 hours. They came across a heavily wooded area.
We got involved in a forest of cedar, the first I had seen since leaving Lake Winnipeg, and which was almost impassable.
This section of the journey follows the Banff-Windermere Parkway for 18 km from Numa Creek to a spot near Vermilion Crossing. Monday, August 23, 1858. Because of a thunderstorm and heavy rain the night before.
Every bush and tree was loaded with moisture. Soon it did not matter much whether we went into the river or not, so that we frequently saved a difficult turn by accepting a ducking.
During the course of this day's journey they discovered
high banks of white gritty calcareous marl, having a chalk-like texture,
a mineral lick, where they found evidence of goats' teeth marks in the mountainside. Later that day they passed through a gorge which is now named Hector Gorge. At one point at the bottom of the valley they came across soft white sandy slates.
The men, by Nimrod's advice, carried away pieces of this soft slate, and at night they were all busy manufacturing pipes from it.
Goats can still be seen, munching the marl, at the Mount Wardle mineral lick where their forebears 8 centuries ago. Mountain goats are distinguishable by their white coats and short black horns. Mountain sheep are identified by their brownish-colored coat, white rump patch, and in the male, massive curled horns. Further along the same highway the Hector Gorge viewpoint shows the start of the 10 kilometers long gorge. Tuesday, August 24, 1858. The camp was awakened by some startling news.
This morning Nimrod, who had set off early to hunt, returned shortly as white as it is for Indian to be with fear. He had been chasing a deer, and had suddenly come on a panther, but further than saying that he had wounded him, we could get him to tell us nothing. From seeing them so seldom the Indians are much more afraid of them than they are of grizzly bears, although there is no comparison between the ferocity of the two animals.
Wednesday, August 25, 1858. Hector changed his course from a southeast direction to a northwest direction.
I should have liked very much to have descended the Kootenay River for some distance, to find if there is any gap in its valley by which a passage could be effected to the west without following down the stream. But my orders to confine myself to the waterline of the mountains, and which required me to be back at Fort Edmonton early in October, limited me to a less extended circuit in the mountains than I should then have required to make.
Hector was also concerned there was little game in the region and they were running short of provisions. A great deal of beaver activity was seen.
We saw where they had been cutting up trees 5 and 6 inches in thickness into short billets, to use in constructing their houses and dams. That night in camp, we heard the cries of a panther, which are exactly like those of an infant. Nimrod says that they call in this manner when they come on the tracks of men or horses, and he seemed to think it might come close, or even into our camp during the night. So when he lay down to sleep, he kept his dagger, or big Indian knife, close to his hand.
The location where Hector changed direction and started to follow the Kootenay River to its source is near the Dolly Varden picnic site, which is 68 kilometers west of Castle Junction. It is interesting to note that Dolly Varden is the name given to the bright orange or red spotted trout popular in western streams. The original Miss Dolly Varden was a character in the novel Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. She was known for wearing pink spotted dresses. This 18-kilometer section of Hector's route from Kootenay Crossing, Kootenay National Park to the Forestry Road cannot be traveled by automobile, only by foot or horseback. It is a one-day hike to Hector's camping spot of August 26. Thursday, August 26, 1858. Although it hadn't rained heavily since they had crossed the Continental Divide, the group and its baggage were drenched from mountain mists.
The constant moisture has had a bad effect on our moose meat, which, although well enough prepared to keep in the dry climate of the east slope, has within the last few days completely rotted. This is the more serious, as we now seldom see any tracks of game.
In his writings on this day, in which the party only covered 13 kilometers, Hector recorded,
"Yesterday, we passed the remnants of very old encampment that must have been inhabited in winter, as the trees round it had been cut down on snowshoes, the stumps being 6 feet high, showing the snow to have been 4 to 5 feet deep. We saw signs of this being a very fine fur country, for marten and other tracks were very abundant, but the absence of game, which is very unaccountable, prevents the Indians tenting up this way to trap."
By noon the group had reached 2 lakes, which are the source of the Kootenay River.
Its shallow waters were thrown into waves by a stiff westerly breeze and splashed on a shore of pure white sand. But when we entered the lake to bathe, we found that a few yards from the shore it had a muddy bottom that was almost unfathomable.
Nevertheless, Hector was enraptured with the birds and began to see many plants that, until then, he had failed to notice. Friday, August 27, 1858. Continuing their journey northward, they came across the Beaverfoot River after traveling through a few kilometers of mossy swamps and small deep lakes crowded with brightly colored flowers. Hector named 2 mountains in the region respectively, Mount Vaux, after William S. W. Vaux, a collector of coins for the British Museum and a friend of Captain John Palliser, and Mount Goodsir, after one of Hector's teachers, John Goodsir, professor of anatomy at Edinburgh University. At this time Hector and his group were running short of provisions.
In the afternoon we passed 2 large streams in the valleys of which grew quantities of raspberries, which were very welcome, as we had almost no provisions left.
Even their attempts to catch trout for their supper were unsuccessful. In the vicinity of Beaverfoot Lodge Hector's party camped for the night. Saturday, August 28, 1858. The party was forced to chop its way through fallen timber and had only covered 10 kilometers when a violent storm forced them to make camp. Sunday, August 29, 1858. A memorable day for James Hector. Today he was to discover Wapta Falls, be kicked unconscious by his horse, almost be buried alive and nearly starved to death, all within 1 hour and a half. Hector wrote that for the last few days their horses were faring badly. They couldn't find grass for them to eat and
their legs are also getting very badly cut by the constant leaping and scrambling over the fallen timber, so that on the whole they have their tempers and patience tried a good deal.
About mid-morning they come across a fine fall of 40 feet, which is now called Wapta Falls after the stony Indian word Wapta, which means river.
A little way above this fall, one of our pack horses, to escape the fallen timber, plunged into the stream, luckily where it formed an eddy, but the banks were so steep that we had difficulty getting him out. In attempting to reach the water, he kicked me in the chest, but luckily I got close to him before he struck out, so that I did not get the full force of the blow. However, it knocked me down and rendered me senseless for some time. This was unfortunate, as we had seen no tracks of game in the neighborhood, and were now without food. But I was so hurt that we could not proceed further that day at least. My men covered me up under a tree, and I sent them all off to try and raise something to eat.
A slightly different version of this incident can be found in the book, The Romantic History of the CPR. It tells about Hector's assistants preparing to bury him. The Indians with the party were in fear of attack by a hostile tribe and were anxious to push on. They thought that Hector had been killed, so they hastily dug a shallow grave into which they lowered the body. They were about to shovel in the earth when they noticed a flicker in the eyelids of the corpse, so they lifted Hector out again and found to everyone's joy that he was still alive.
As I was quite unable to move, I sent my interpreter, Peter Erasmus, to ascend Mount Hunter, which is included in the angle of Kicking Horse River.
While Hector recovered from his injuries, his men went hunting. Unfortunately, they returned empty-handed. It is believed that Mount Hunter is named after John Hunter, a famous Scottish anatomist and surgeon. Almost 45 years later, Hector would tell friends that he could remember exactly the spot where he was nearly buried alive. Monday, August 30, 1858. While Hector continued his recovery, his men, again, went looking for food. Erasmus and Brown found a herd of goats, but the only one they were able to shoot went and fell over a deep precipice out of their reach. The guide, Nimrod, became lame after a sharp spike ran into his foot while he was chasing a wapiti. Hector recorded,
"We were now in a bad way as, although I had kept a private cache of about 5 pounds of pemmican, which I now produced. It was only enough for one meal for us all. He hoped to stretch the food for at least 3 days, by which time he hoped they would find game."
After 5 weeks' travel, today was the first day when no progress was recorded. Tuesday, August 31, 1858. Because Hector was still in considerable pain, the party traveled slowly and only covered 8 kilometers this day. However, in remembrance of Hector's accident, his men named the river the Kicking Horse River. Using large cod hooks and twine, they were unsuccessful, again, at catching any fish. Wednesday, September 1, 1858. After an early start, the party covered 19 kilometers along the Kicking Horse River. Thursday, September 2, 1858. This morning,
traveled on the Shingle Flat, which occupies the full width of the valley, crossing and recrossing the river, for 8 kilometers.
The group had reached the start of a big hill, that is the slope where the Canadian Pacific Railway spiral tunnel is located. They ascended the hill rapidly,
but loitered a good deal to eat large blueberries, that grew in abundance, and which we were very glad to get, although not very substantial food, when we had been fasting altogether for the past day, and living on only very short allowance for the previous 5.
As they climbed over moss-covered rocks, the horses were continually sliding and falling. One pack horse, more clumsy than the others, lost its balance and fell about 46 meters down a precipitous slope. Catching himself on trees, the animal finally ended up astride a dead tree. Hector wrote that the horse
slid on a dead tree that stuck out at right angles to the slope, balancing himself with his legs dangling on either side of the trunk of the tree in a most comical manner.
They detoured about 1.5 kilometers to rescue the animal from its predicament. They continued traveling for 8 hours past small lakes and finally camped
in a beautiful spot beside a lake with excellent pasture for the horses,
which is most likely today's Summit Lake. Tonight they ate meat for supper.
I had killed a grouse and we were glad to boil it up with some ends of candles and odd pieces of grease, to make something like a supper for the 5 of us after a very hard day's work. We were now 1,275 feet above our encampment of last night, and the cold was very sharp, and we felt it more severely in our famished state.
Friday, September 3, 1858. Hector finally felt recovered enough from his accident to go hunting with Nimrod. They traveled a few kilometers on foot and soon Nimrod shot a moose.
It was a doe and very lean, but, notwithstanding, we soon set about cooking and eating to make up for our long fast. It was not till we got the food that we all found out how depressed and weak we were, as desperation had been keeping us up. I had 3 days before promised that if nothing was killed by today I would kill one of the horses, and this evening, if Nimrod had not killed the moose, the old grey that fell over the cliff would have been sacrificed. I had refrained from killing a horse sooner, as I have been warned by experienced travelers that once the first horse is killed for food many more are sure to follow, as the flesh of a horse out of condition is so inferior as merely to create a craving for large quantities of it, without giving the strength or vigor to induce the hunters to exert themselves to kill other game. The prospect of starving is then looked on with indifference, as they know it will be avoided by killing another horse, until at last too few are left to carry the necessaries for the party, who then undergo great sufferings and, as in the case of several American expeditions, some may even perish.
Descending the east side of the Kicking Horse Pass, they followed Bath Creek to the approximate location of the Icefields Parkway Junction. The group traveled 16 kilometers along the House River, named after Joseph House, for trader and explorer, who journeyed through the pass in 1809. During the afternoon, one of their pack horses, carrying Hector's collection of plants and animal skins, plunged into the waters of Glacier Lake. The animal, which, a few days earlier had jumped into the Kicking Horse River, was retrieved and its pack dried out. Glacier Lake was so named by Hector because of the massive glacier at the western end. Tonight, they tried shooting bats.
We found that the noise was echoed in a most wonderful manner by the successive points from side to side of the lake, the report being thus repeated in a sharp, distinct manner 6 or 8 times.
Sunday, September 12, 1858. Hector moved their camp to the base of the glacier and explored the valley floor. Hector spent the day with Sutherland exploring the glacier. Their Indian guide Nimrod turned down their invitation to accompany them.
I wished Nimrod to go with me, but he would not venture on the ice, but told all sorts of stories of sad disasters that had befallen those Indians that ever did so. How that, if they did not get lost in a crevasse, they were at least sure to be unlucky afterwards in their hunting.
Although it was cold on their feet, Hector and Sutherland wore moccasins without socks in order to get a better foothold in the ice. They stepped warily around chasms and breaks in the ice.
We had to go a great way round to avoid one of these rents, and at last had to jump it when about 4 feet wide, and, as I found, by timing the fall of stones, 160 feet deep.
During their investigation of the glacier they saw ice pinnacles crashing, which days earlier they had mistaken for the sounds of thunder. From high on the glaciers,
we had a splendid view over the Mer de Glace to the south and west, the mountain valleys being quite obliterated, and the peaks and ridges standing out like islands through the icy mantle.
The high peak at the center of the glacier was named Mount Lyell by Hector after the noted British geologist, Sir Charles Lyell. The glacier became known as the Lyell Icefield in 1964. Later in the day they climbed a nearby peak which Hector named Sullivan's Peak after John W. Sullivan, astronomer and secretary of the Palliser Expedition. Across the lake,
there is one peak that has a pyramidal top completely wrapped in snow and at least double the height of where I stood above the valley.
Hector named this peak Mount Forbes in honor of his longtime friend, natural history professor, Edward Forbes. Hector and Sutherland encountered a small problem on their descent.
At one point we thought at first we should require to turn back, and gain the surface of the glacier as we came to a precipice that was closely hemmed in between a wall of ice and one of rock. However, by knotting our leather shirts together, and taking off our moccasins, which were now frozen, we managed to get past the difficulty, and pushing on rapidly reached our camp at 8 o'clock.
While Hector and Sutherland climbed the glacier, his other men hunted for game but returned empty-handed.
We were now limited to the dry lean moose meat, which has not much more nourishment in it than chips of parchment.
At night they saw
a great glare of flame down the valley at the lower end of the lake, and we rightly conjectured that the fire we left at our halting place among the fallen woods had set the forest on fire.
Tuesday, September 14, 1858. The party broke camp early and within 2 hours came across a still burning forest. Stumbling through the smoldering underbrush,
our horses' legs suffered a good deal.
In time they reached the main valley of the North Saskatchewan. After traveling only 13 kilometers they set up camp among some sand hills.
Near our camp we found some old buffalo dung, and the Indians told us that not many years ago there were many of these animals along the valley of the North Saskatchewan, within the mountains. 11 years ago, they say, there were great fires all through the mountains, and in the woods along their eastern base, and after that a disease broke out among all the animals, so that they used to find wapiti, moose, and other deer, as well as buffalo, lying dead in numbers. Before that time, somewhere about 1847 or 1848, there was abundance of game in all parts of the country. But since then there has been great scarcity of animals, and only the best hunters can make sure of killing.
Hector was returning from the west end of Glacier Lake approximately to the junction of the Icefields Parkway and the David Thompson Highway. Wednesday, September 15, 1858. At a point along the bank of the North Saskatchewan, the Stoney Indian orphan boy and Nimrod joined up with Hector, bringing with them some goats they had killed.
We tried to eat the goat meat, which was that of a fine young kid, and was fat and exceedingly good-looking. But in spite of our hunger none of us could retain it on our stomachs, as the rank musty flavor gave rise to intense nausea. In the afternoon, we went very fast, and after 12 miles we crossed a rocky point where the river abruptly changes its course to the north, entering a wide valley that is prolonged through the mountains.
The region, known as the Kootenay Plains, is about 12 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. It was well known as the place where annually, the Kootenay Indians exchanged their furs with the traders from Rocky Mountain House. The party made especially good time that day. Hector traveled along the route of the David Thompson Highway, Highway 11, east of the Parkway Junction.
The rocky point where the river abruptly changes its course to the north
is now called Whirlpool Point and is 19.6 kilometers from the junction. The Kootenay Plains area is now partially flooded by the Abraham Lake, which has formed behind the Bighorn Dam. The lake was named after Silas Abraham, a Stoney Indian, and his family, who lived in the area for many years. Thursday, September 16, 1858. While Erasmus, Nimrod, and the Stoney Indian orphan boy went hunting for mountain sheep, Hector backtracked to a nearby rocky point now called Whirlpool Point, but which Hector named Pine Point. He examined its geological structure and identified the vegetation. Saturday, September 18, 1858. On this day Hector recorded that he named a lofty peak, Mount Murchison. Sir Roderick Impey Murchison was Director General of the Geological Survey of Great Britain and President of the Royal Geographical Society. He had recommended Hector as a member of the Palliser Expedition. About 4 p.m. Hector and his party left the mountains, just 38 days since they had entered them from Old Beaufort.
Well, that's it for this program, I guess. I want to thank you I hope you enjoyed working through the Hector Journal. I can tell you right now, I really enjoyed it some 40 years ago when I went and retraced the route through the park using the journal of James Hector. And there's a few things I'd like to mention just at the end here. First of all, I hope that educators will see the idea of using this type of a program where you take a journal, an original journal, and make a little film on it and get the kids to do the sketches and put it together and let them keep it, edit it, and let it be theirs. Not only do they get a chance to learn history, they get a chance to practice their art and appreciate the mountains and nature and the whole bit. I'm a great believer in sketches and letting the kids be creative and put their own ideas into things. And I think that this is probably something that educators will appreciate. I want to mention that Murchison also fits into the story, that he recommended Hector for a similar job in New Zealand, and Hector became the leading geologist in New Zealand for many, many decades. Another part of the story is when he came back to Canada 40 years after being kicked by the horse at Kicking Horse Pass, he showed them where it had happened. But the sad part of the story is that his son, Douglas, I believe his name was, got sick and was rushed to the hospital in Revelstoke and died there of appendicitis. So he's buried in the cemetery in Revelstoke. Another part of the story is 40 years ago or so, 40 years ago, I contacted the geological department in New Zealand and asked them if they could provide me with a picture of the grave for the book that I was putting together. They hadn't thought about it for years, and one Sunday one of the men took his family out and they went grave hunting and found the monument in the Wellington Cemetery and sent a picture of it. He was quite taken back by the fact that it wasn't in good shape, and I put it on my website that I had at the time. And a few years later I got a picture back from New Zealand showing that they had been activating the whole project and the grave had been restored. And so I guess I felt a little good about that, my contribution to science. Anyway, it's been great having you on this. If you got this far, and it shows you might have some interest, and I hope you'll share it with as many people as you can. I have another book that I did on Paul Kane. I've got partway done. The voices are all there, and I may be able to, if time gives me the opportunity. I'm an old man now, of course. I will try and do the same thing again and share it with you. And so I say goodbye, thank you, and to my alter ego, the stick man, I want to thank you, because I didn't realize until halfway through the book here that, yes, he does look a bit like me with the same bald head and glasses. That was quite the accident, because normally I do the program with a hat on, and I use different glasses so I can see the screen. So that's good. And also I want to thank the voices that I managed to find, and I think they did a pretty good job, much better than I ever would have. So thank you, voices. So see you, everybody. Bye.